It is July the 20th, 2026, and for 8 consecutive nights, American bombers, fighter jets, and electronic warfare aircraft have been hammering targets inside Iran. Bandar Abbas in the south, Tehran in the north. Coastal surveillance sites erased, underground missile storage collapsed. And this round is different from the 7 that came before it, because for the first time, U.S. Central Command didn't just talk about degrading Iranian capability. It said the word punish. It said the words Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, out loud, by name, on the record. That single change in language is the story, because language from a military command that controls this much firepower is never accidental. Every word in a CENTCOM statement is vetted, reviewed, and chosen for a reason. And the reason this time has a name, a date, and a grieving family that hasn't even been notified yet. But to understand why the United States just shifted from degrading Iran's war machine to explicitly hunting the men who run it, you need to back all the way up. Because this didn't start 8 nights ago, it didn't even start this month. What is now being called the 2026 Iran War began earlier this year when American and Israeli forces struck Iran's nuclear program directly. An operation President Trump has repeatedly framed around a single unmoving objective: never allowing Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. That opening campaign was supposed to be decisive. It wasn't. Iran absorbed the damage, rebuilt what it could, and settled into a war of attrition that has now stretched across months, dozens of American casualties, and at least one collapsed ceasefire. That collapsed ceasefire is the hinge this entire story turns on. Weeks ago, Washington and Tehran quietly signed a memorandum of understanding. A fragile pause, both governments publicly described as progress, and privately treated as a truce held together with tape. It didn't hold. Iran walked away from it after accusing the United States of violating its terms. Washington says Iran never honored the agreement in the first place, pointing to continued harassment of commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point narrow enough that you can see both coastlines from a ship passing through it, and one that carries roughly 1/5 of the entire world's seaborne oil supply. Whoever controls that strait controls a lever that can move global energy prices within hours of pulling it. Iran has understood that leverage for decades. Every serious war Iran has fought with the West in the modern era has run through it in some form, and this one is no exception. Since that ceasefire collapsed, the casualty count on the American side has been climbing in a way that rarely produces a single dramatic headline, but adds up to something much larger once you lay the events out in sequence. 6 U.S. Army Reserve soldiers were killed on March 1st when an Iranian strike hit an operations center at Kuwait's Shuaibah port. An Army sergeant died days later from injuries sustained in a related attack in Saudi Arabia. On March 12th, 6 more service members were lost when a KC-135 Stratotanker, a refueling aircraft, went down in western Iraq, an incident the military has said was not connected to enemy fire. A Navy helicopter went missing over the Arabian Sea in early July, and the search for that crew member was eventually suspended. Each of those was covered, briefly, as its own isolated tragedy. Together, they are the body count of a war that both governments have spent months trying to describe as something smaller than it actually is. And that pattern of understatement is exactly what makes what happened on July 17th so significant. It broke the pattern. Now let's talk about what actually happened that night, because this is the detail the entire 8th night response is built around. According to U.S. Central Command, American and partner forces were defending against a wave of Iranian ballistic missiles and drones aimed at Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, a facility that hosts American troops and fighter jets, when 2 service members were killed in action. A third was listed as missing. 4 others were medically evacuated to hospitals in Jordan and have since been discharged. Additional personnel with minor injuries have already returned to duty. CENTCOM said it would withhold the identities of the fallen until 24 hours after their families are notified. A standard of respect that exists precisely because these announcements ripple through real homes long before they ripple through headlines. In the hours after that statement, searchers at the strike site recovered unidentified remains, a grim update that suggests the missing service member's case may already be resolved in the worst possible way, even before an official confirmation formally closes the loop. These are the first American combat deaths from Iranian fire since March. That gap matters. A war can sit in a holding pattern for months. The moment fresh American blood is spilled, that holding pattern ends. That is not a training accident. That is not friendly fire. That is a U.S. partner nation's airbase taking direct ballistic missile fire, specifically because American forces operate out of it. And this is where the story changes completely, because the reaction from the region was not muted diplomatic language. The Gulf Cooperation Council's leadership condemned the wave of strikes against Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain as a dangerous escalation, one that has increasingly reached toward infrastructure with no military value at all. Neither Washington nor Tehran has shown the slightest interest in stepping back from that trajectory. If anything, both sides have spent the last 72 hours proving the opposite. This is not the first time the Strait of Hormuz has functioned as a lever in a war between Iran and the outside world. During the so-called tanker war of the 1980s, when Iran and Iraq spent years attacking neutral shipping to strangle each other's oil exports, the United States eventually put its own navy in the strait to protect commercial vessels, and the confrontation nearly escalated into direct war between Washington and Tehran on more than one occasion. That history matters here because it tells you Iran's current playbook is not improvised. Threatening the world's oil supply through that specific channel of water is one of the oldest and most reliable pressure tactics in Tehran's arsenal, precisely because it forces outside powers to respond, and forcing a response is the entire point. And this is the part of the story that actually reaches into your life even if you have never set foot near the Persian Gulf. A sustained threat to traffic through the Strait of Hormuz does not stay contained to shipping companies and oil ministries. Insurers price war risk into every tanker that transits the strait, and that cost gets passed down the chain until it shows up at a gas pump thousands of miles away from any of the footage in this story. Every night this campaign continues. Without a resolution is another night that risk premium sits baked into global energy markets, quietly in the background, while the headlines focus on missiles and bombers instead of the invoice that eventually lands on an ordinary household. That is the mechanism connecting an airbase in Jordan to a fuel bill in a country that has no direct stake in this war at all, and it is exactly why a regional conflict like this one never actually stays regional for long. It is also worth sitting with what a worldwide caution alert from the State Department actually signals, because most viewers scroll past that phrase without registering its weight. These alerts are not issued lightly, and they are not issued regionally when the department believes a crisis is regional. A worldwide alert means the government's own risk assessment has expanded past the borders of the conflict zone entirely into the assumption that American citizens and interests anywhere on the planet could become a target of opportunity for retaliation, proxy action, or simple opportunism riding on the back of a bigger war. The last time an alert of this scope went out was during the opening weeks of this same conflict. Its return now is the clearest non-military signal available that Washington's own internal assessment of where this is heading has shifted sharply in the last several days. So let's look at exactly what the American response looked like, because the specifics matter here more than the rhetoric surrounding them. Hours after the Jordan attack, not days, U.S. Central Command launched its 8th consecutive night of strikes against Iranian targets. CENTCOM's own statement said the operation was designed to further degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, and to swiftly punish Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces who launched the attack on American service members in Jordan. Read that again. Because across the previous 7 nights of this campaign, the public language coming out of Central Command stayed clinical. Surveillance sites, logistics infrastructure, underground weapon storage, maritime capability, institutional, procedural, almost bloodless phrasing built to describe a war of attrition against buildings and radar stations. The 8th night broke that pattern in 2 specific ways. It named an organization instead of a category of target, and it used the word punish instead of degrade. That is not the language of attrition. That is the language of retribution, and retribution campaigns do not de-escalate on their own. They compound, because every strike now carries the implicit promise of another one behind it. This is also the part most surface-level coverage is missing entirely. The shift in tone lines up almost exactly with a separate, quieter military movement that had already been underway for days before the Jordan attack even happened. Satellite trackers and open-source flight monitors had already documented the withdrawal of roughly 30 aerial refueling tankers from Ben Gurion Airport near Tel Aviv, a drawdown driven by pressure on Israeli civilian air traffic, which had been getting crowded out by military aircraft parked on the tarmac. And then, within 72 hours of the Jordan attack, that drawdown reversed hard. Israeli officials confirmed the United States is preparing to send dozens of additional refueling tankers back into Israel, restoring the fleet to roughly the level it held at the opening of the war, when as many as 70 tanker and cargo aircraft were reportedly parked there at once. Aerial refueling tankers are the least glamorous aircraft in any Air Force's inventory, and also the single asset that determines how far a bombing campaign can actually reach. Without them, a strike aircraft has a fixed operational ceiling defined entirely by its internal fuel tanks. With them repositioned forward, that ceiling disappears. Whatever comes next in this war, it is being physically built for range, right now, on the tarmac at Ben Gurion. That brings us to the part of this story that requires slowing all the way down, because the military mechanics behind these 8 nights are not incidental details. They are the message itself. Every reported strike package against Iranian air defense, radar, and missile infrastructure depends on one aircraft doing its job perfectly and invisibly before anything else happens. The EA-18G Growler. This is a 2-seat, carrier-capable electronic warfare aircraft built off the airframe of the FA-18F Super Hornet, except its weapons bays and sensor suite have been rebuilt around the ALQ-99 jamming system and AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missiles. Its job is to blind Iran's integrated air defense network before anything else in the package ever crosses into contested airspace. Here's the actual mechanism. Iranian ground radar activates to try to track an incoming strike package. The Growler detects that emission, identifies its exact frequency, and has two options available in the same instant. It can jam the frequency directly, flooding it with electronic noise until the operator's screen becomes unreadable static. Or it can ride that same emission back to its source with a radiation-seeking missile and take the site off the air permanently. In practice, it frequently does both, simultaneously, against multiple emitters spread across a single strike corridor. By the time the rest of the package arrives over target, Iran's radar operators are often flying blind against an enemy they can no longer see coming, on a screen that is telling them nothing useful at all. The Growler rarely appears in footage and never gets named in a headline. It is also the single aircraft that makes every other aircraft in the package survivable, which is exactly why Doctrine treats it as the first asset into any contested corridor, and the last one out. Behind that cleared corridor sits the precision strike workhorse of this entire campaign, the F-16 flying in both Block 50 and Block 52 configurations. This is not a new platform making a surprise appearance. It has been the backbone of American tactical air power for 3 decades, and in this specific war, it has been handling close-range, high-precision delivery against exactly the kind of target that requires accuracy instead of raw explosive mass. Its AN/APG-68 radar paired with GBU-38 precision-guided munitions gives it the ability to put a 500-pound bomb through a specific structure inside a specific compound identified by intelligence gathered hours or even days earlier, often by a pilot who hasn't personally seen the target package until minutes before stepping out to the jet. That is the platform most likely responsible for the reported strikes on IRGC headquarters facilities, coastal radar nodes, and the surveillance and maritime infrastructure that requires pinpoint accuracy rather than area saturation. Flight trackers have already logged at least a dozen additional F-16s moving from Spangdahlem Air Base in Germany toward Muwafaq, Salti Air Base in Jordan. That is the exact same base that came under Iranian missile fire on July 17th. That is not a coincidence. That is direct reinforcement flowing into the base that just took casualties, arriving fast enough to suggest it was already in motion before the attack was even fully assessed. And then there is the platform that has not been officially confirmed for this specific round of strikes, but whose fingerprints are all over the buildup surrounding it, the B-52 Stratofortress. First entered service in 1961, 18 years before the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps itself was even founded. It has been rebuilt, re-engined, and re-equipped so many times since then that the only original component left on a modern H model is essentially the airframe shell. A single B-52 can carry up to 20 AGM-86B air-launched cruise missiles externally, along with additional ordnance internally, or the newer JSM-ER, a 500-mile standoff missile with a low radar cross-section that flies autonomously to its target after release. The tactical significance of that range is enormous. The B-52 does not need to cross into contested Iranian airspace at all. It can orbit well outside the threat envelope, release its cruise missiles from a rotary launcher in the bomb bay, and let those missiles fly low-altitude, terrain-following routes into Iran, while the bomber itself turns back toward friendly airspace. Iran's integrated air defense network was designed to detect and engage aircraft. It was never built to track 20 separate cruise missiles, arriving simultaneously from different vectors at 500 feet off the ground. Whether or not a B-52 has flown an actual combat sortie into this specific 8th night package remains formally unconfirmed as of this writing. What is confirmed is the infrastructure being rebuilt underneath it, and infrastructure like that does not get rebuilt for aircraft that aren't coming. There's a fourth platform in this equation that gets less attention than any of the aircraft, and it might be doing more damage than all of them combined. The carrier strike group operating in the region, delivering Tomahawk cruise missiles against targets that don't require a manned aircraft anywhere near Iranian airspace at all. A Tomahawk launch doesn't risk a pilot, it doesn't need a tanker, it just needs a ship already in position. And American carrier groups in this theater have been in position for months. Layer all 4 of these together, the Growler clearing the electronic corridor, the F-16 delivering precision munitions against close-in targets the Growler has already blinded, a heavy bomber or a carrier's Tomahawks, handling the deep, fixed infrastructure that requires mass and range rather than precision alone, and you get a strike architecture Iran's air defense planners were never built to counter. 3 or 4 completely different threat vectors, arriving on different timelines against a network that has now absorbed 8 consecutive nights of degradation. That is not a symbolic show of force. That is a system specifically engineered to exploit every gap left in whatever is still standing of Iran's air picture. Now let's put hard numbers on what this campaign has actually produced, because vague descriptions of a war tend to undersell exactly how large it has become. 8 consecutive nights of American strikes, roughly 50,000 American service members currently operating across the broader Middle East theater, according to CENTCOM's own public accounting. At least 2, and quite possibly 3, additional American combat deaths in the past 72 hours alone. Roughly 30 aerial refueling tankers already stationed in Israel, with dozens more inbound to bring that number back toward wartime peak levels. At least a dozen additional F-16s flowing into the exact Jordanian base that came under fire. And on a second front that most coverage of this war treats as entirely unrelated, Ukraine launched more than 370 drones into Russian territory overnight, striking 2 logistics hubs tied to Russia's drone manufacturing supply chain in the Moscow and Tambov regions, along with an oil depot near the town of Noginsk that forced the evacuation of a nearby maternity hospital. At least 8 people were killed and more than 60 wounded in what regional officials described as the most damaging deep strike inside Russia in over 2 years. Russian analysts have since estimated the total economic cost of that single night's damage at more than $1 billion, and Moscow's own governor claimed the strikes disrupted close to 1/10 of one company's entire logistics capacity in a single pass. There is a reason crews who actually fly the F-16 almost never call it by its official name, the Fighting Falcon, and instead call it the Viper. It is a small detail, but it says something real about how these platforms are actually regarded inside the services that operate them, versus how they get described in press releases. The Viper is treated as a proven, trusted tool by the people who fly it into contested airspace night after night, not a showpiece. The same is true of the B-52 in a different way. A bomber that entered service in 1961 is not still flying combat-relevant missions in 2026 by accident or nostalgia. It is still flying because the airframe has proven durable enough and adaptable enough to new missiles and new electronics that replacing it has never been more cost-effective than upgrading it again. That kind of institutional trust in old, thoroughly modernized hardware is itself a signal. Militaries send their most reliable, most survivable assets into the missions they consider most consequential. They do not send them for a symbolic gesture. Lay all of those numbers next to each other, and the shape of this week becomes obvious in a way that no single headline captures on its own. 8 nights of strikes, 50,000 American troops in theater, 2 to 3 fresh American deaths, 30 tankers already forward deployed with dozens more inbound, a dozen additional F-16s landing at the exact base that just took missile fire, 370 drones over Moscow in a single night on a completely different front. 8 dead and 60 wounded in that same single night. $1 billion in damage to a single company's logistics network in a single pass. None of those numbers exist in isolation. They are all data points describing the same underlying reality. 2 American-aligned military efforts on 2 separate continents, both accelerating at the exact same moment, both drawing on the same finite pool of Western attention and resources. That last detail is not a tangent. It is the third track in a convergence. Most coverage of this war refuses to connect, because covering 3 fronts honestly is harder than covering one cleanly. Track 1 is financial. Iran's ongoing harassment of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz is a direct assault on global energy logistics. And the American response is explicitly by CENTCOM's own stated language, designed to strip away that leverage piece by piece, strike by strike, until the threat to commercial traffic simply stops being credible. Track 2 is military, and it is no longer confined to a single front. The United States is simultaneously reinforcing a Middle Eastern air campaign, while Ukraine is independently executing the deepest strikes of its own war against Russian territory. Both American-aligned efforts drawing on the same overstretched pool of Western tankers, munitions, satellite intelligence, and political attention at the exact same moment. Track 3 is psychological. The State Department has now issued a worldwide caution alert to American citizens abroad, the first alert of that scope since the opening weeks of this war. That is not a bureaucratic formality. That is the U.S. government publicly acknowledging that the risk environment for its own citizens has expanded well beyond the borders of Iran itself, out into a world that suddenly feels smaller and more exposed than it did a week ago. When a financial choke point, a 2-front military escalation, and a global security warning all converge inside the same 72-hour window, the resulting pressure on decision-makers in Tehran is not additive. It is compounding, and compounding pressure has a well-documented habit of producing decisions made under urgency, rather than decisions made with judgment. So who is actually making those decisions on the other side of this? This is the part of the story that gets flattened the most in casual coverage, because Iran's power structure is not a single chain of command with one man at the top issuing orders down a clean, traceable line. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was founded in 1979, built specifically as a parallel military structure loyal to the revolutionary government, rather than to the conventional Iranian armed forces. It was designed to watch over from the inside. Every senior figure currently sitting in Iran's civilian government cabinet came up through that exact same institutional pipeline. The uniforms have changed over the decades. The institutional loyalty underneath them has not. That distinction matters enormously right now because it means the targets CENTCOM is describing as Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces are not a separate militant faction operating loosely alongside Iran's government. They are functionally inseparable from it, which is exactly why naming them directly, by name, in an official strike statement is such a significant escalation in language. Iran's supreme leader has publicly rejected the American position, framing the renewed strikes as a violation of the earlier Memorandum of Understanding and Warning, through state media, of consequences the regime has described as unforgettable if the American campaign continues. Break down what the regime is actually claiming, point by point, because each one carries a different function. The first claim is that Washington violated the Memorandum of Understanding first, which is designed to shift blame for the ceasefire's collapse away from Tehran and onto the United States, even as American officials point to continued Iranian harassment of shipping as the actual trigger. The second claim, that unforgettable consequences await if strikes continue, is designed to project strength to a domestic Iranian audience that has now watched 8 nights of American air power go largely unanswered in any way that changed the outcome on the ground. The third claim, that a significant part of Iran's military capability has not yet been used, is the most interesting one strategically, because it is simultaneously a threat and an admission. If true, it means Tehran has been holding back assets rather than committing them, which raises the question of why a regime under this much pressure would still be sitting on unused capability instead of deploying it. If false, it is pure deterrence theater aimed at making the United States hesitate before pushing further. Either way, the claim is doing more work as psychology than as military fact. Iranian officials have also floated the idea of a ground operation aimed at seizing American bases inside Kuwait, a threat that would require achieving air superiority Iran does not currently possess, and has shown no operational sign of being able to seize against a coalition that has spent 8 straight nights demonstrating the opposite. Whether that threat is a genuine operational plan or a piece of domestic messaging aimed at an Iranian public increasingly aware of how badly this war has gone is impossible to verify from the outside looking in. What is verifiable is that Iran has continued launching ballistic missiles toward American and Allied positions, even as its own air defense network absorbs nightly degradation. And that tells you something important about how the people actually making these decisions are weighing risk right now, at this exact moment, with the walls closing in around their own strategic options. Underneath the Supreme Leader sits a body most Western coverage never bothers to name, the Supreme National Security Council, the actual room where Iran's wartime decisions get finalized before they ever reach a podium or a state television broadcast. Its membership overlaps heavily with the Revolutionary Guard's senior command structure, which means the people advising on whether to escalate are frequently the same people whose forces are being degraded nightly by American strikes. That is a conflict of institutional interest with real consequences. A conventional military officer, weighing whether to keep fighting a losing air war, has an obvious incentive to be honest about the cost. A Revolutionary Guard commander sitting on the council that decides whether the Guard keeps fighting has the opposite incentive, because admitting the war is unwinnable is also admitting his own institution has failed at the one job it was built for in 1979, defending the revolution by force. That structural conflict of interest is a large part of why this war keeps escalating instead of settling, and it is precisely the kind of internal dynamic that never makes it into a headline, but quietly decides how every headline after it gets written. Here's the honest strategic assessment, stripped of the version either government wants you to walk away believing. Iran's public rhetoric has escalated toward talk of new fronts and unforgettable consequences, language that reads as maximalist specifically because Tehran's actual battlefield options have narrowed to almost nothing. 8 nights of systematic strikes against radar, missile storage, and command infrastructure do not happen to a military that is winning, and they don't happen to one that Washington believes is close to backing down peacefully either. At the same time, the American side is visibly repositioning for a campaign with more range and more endurance, not less, which suggests this is nowhere close to a negotiated off-ramp. The next 48 to 72 hours matter because the tanker buildup, the reinforcement of F-16s into Jordan, and the shift in CENTCOM's own language toward explicit retribution all point in the same direction at once, toward expansion, not toward a pause. Whether that expansion involves a confirmed B-52 combat sortie, a strike on the underground facility widely referenced in open-source tracking circles as Pickaxe Mountain and linked to Iran's nuclear program, or something else entirely, is the open question every serious analyst currently watching this conflict is trying to answer. None of them can answer it with certainty yet, and anyone who tells you they can is selling you something. That uncertainty is exactly what should keep you watching this closely, because the single structural risk running underneath every part of this story is not a headline event waiting to happen. It is command fragmentation on the Iranian side, colliding head-on with an American campaign that is deliberately expanding its reach and its rhetoric at the same time. When one side's decision-making structure is this blurred between a civilian government and a parallel military hierarchy, loyal to something other than a clean chain of command, and the other side has just shifted its public language from degradation to punishment, the room for miscalculation that neither government actually intended shrinks fast. It has already happened once in the last week alone. Debris from intercepted Iranian missiles aimed at American and Jordanian positions has already crossed into Israeli territory, even though Israel has not formally joined this latest round of American strikes. That is the exact kind of accidental spillover that can turn a two-country war into a regional one within a single night, without either government ever deciding to make that choice on purpose. None of this resolves cleanly, and it isn't supposed to. 8 nights ago, this campaign was still being described in the sterile language of degraded infrastructure. Tonight, American commanders are using the word punish out loud about a specific organization, while refueling tankers stream back into Israeli airspace and a nuclear-linked mountain facility sits somewhere on a target list that nobody outside a small circle of decision-makers has actually seen in full. 2 service members are dead. A third may already be. And whatever comes on Night 9 is being built right now, in the air, over open water, and inside a chain of command on the other side of the world that answers to men who never really stopped wearing the uniform they claim they took off decades ago. Go back to where this hour started. 8 nights of strikes across a country the size of Alaska. A base in Jordan still counting its wounded. A refueling fleet quietly rebuilding itself on a tarmac in Israel, while everyone was watching the missiles instead. That is the actual shape of this war right now, not the version being flattened into a single scrolling headline. The degrading has been happening for a week. The punishing just started. And a regime built in 1979 to survive exactly this kind of pressure is now facing it from a military that has spent 8 consecutive nights proving it can reach anywhere on the map it wants to. Whether Night 9 looks like a continuation of the same pattern or the moment this war formally crosses into something larger is not a question this video can answer, because the people who will actually decide that have not made the call yet. What is certain is that the infrastructure for a larger war is already in place, fueled and forward deployed, waiting only for the order that turns capability into action. If you want to keep tracking how this develops night by night, subscribe to the channel, because this story is nowhere near finished.